Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Veg Networking Canada. We are a community where plant-based vegan companies connect and collaborate. It is important to honor, acknowledge, and respect that many of us are located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of many Indigenous peoples of Canada. Today, we have a special guest, as always. She is an animal rights litigation superhero, a regular contributor to national publications like the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star. She was previously a founding board member of Mercy for Animals Canada, press secretary to the leader of a federal Canadian party, and a former two-time candidate for Parliament. Veg Networking Canada is pleased to introduce lawyer and executive director of Animal Justice. Welcome, Camille Labchuk.
Thank you so much, Justin. I'm really thrilled to be here with all of you.
Well, for everybody who's here with us live and everybody who's going to be listening, on their own time, can you tell everybody about your own personal plant-based vegan origin story?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Prince Edward Island on the East Coast, and I was always around animals when I was a child. We had cats, we had hamsters, we had rabbits at one point. So they were part of my life, and I appreciated that they were individuals. But it wasn't until I was about 10 years old that I saw for the first time on television people clubbing baby seals during the commercial seal slaughter that was happening, right in my backyard on the East Coast. And I just couldn't believe that anyone would do that to an animal because I knew them as, individuals, not objects that you should hurt or kill. And it sparked something in me at that point. A couple years later, when I was 12, I saw a documentary on CBC, and I could not to this day tell you what it was about. My recollection is that it wasn't about animals used for food, but maybe bears in China who were used for bile. But for whatever reason, it sparked something in me to say, that's it. I need to stop eating animals, no more meat. That's out of my life at this point. And I was really lucky because my mom decided to go vegetarian with me. She's always been supportive. She's an activist herself in the environmental sphere. So it was pretty easy for me to do that. And then I started learning years later about veganism. I think that the first time I was introduced to it was reading John Robbins' book, Diet for a New America. Any OG folks who read that or picked it up? It was like one of the few resources out there at the time back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I learned that some people don't eat dairy or eggs either. So I knew at that point I wanted to. But it wasn't until I was out of my undergraduate degree, I did a psychology degree, I had no aspirations to be an activist, that I finally found the motivation. So I was working in Ottawa for Elizabeth May, leader of the Green Party back then, and now again. And I was invited to come to the commercial seal slaughter with Humane Society International to help film it, to help get press attention to it, and to use the images and the footage at the European Union level to convince that jurisdiction of countries to ban the import of seal products. Because most of the seals who were killed were for the European import market. And, luckily I was able to join and we had some great successes. And for me, that was influential for two reasons. The first one is that I was around a group of other vegans for the first time, and I was suddenly like, oh, this is easy, no big deal, I can just do it. I was kind of just like still looking for the intrinsic motivation. And the second thing is I was around a bunch of people who actually had full-time jobs working in animal advocacy. And it was just like a revelation that you could have a career path doing this. So it completely changed my life trajectory. I decided to go to law school, and here I am today.
What a great story. Now, switching gears, which is a perfect segue, kind of how you left that off, from your own personal sort of aha moment for this. What about your aha moments or origin story as it relates to entrepreneurship and becoming a lawyer and going into that, kind of essentially working for yourself, right?
Yeah, so that is a good segue because they were related. I mentioned I was working for Elizabeth May. She is a former environmental lawyer. And I started to see how useful having a law degree was for the advocacy that she was doing. She was a politician at that point, but we would still do work in Parliament. And if you get a new bill and read through it, as a layperson, you're kind of like, I have no idea what's going on here. But as a lawyer, Elizabeth's like, oh, yeah, I see what they're doing. Here's what's good. Here's what's bad. And I just started to appreciate that skill set would be useful to me if I wanted to become an advocate for animals in a deeper professional way. And I also thought, okay, if I'm going to be doing something that a lot of people find to be a marginal activity. Animal rights advocates are still at that point, and still to some extent today, regarded as more of a fringe group of society. I thought I should do something that brought a little bit of credibility to my advocacy, and getting a law degree was a super appealing way to do that. So when I started law school, I was fully prepared for the idea that I wouldn't be able to do animal law right away, and that I would probably have to start an organization to form a structure for this type of work. Luckily, around that same time, some folks were forming the predecessor of animal justice, which was then called Lawyers for Animal Welfare. So I get in on the ground floor, and I finished law school. I worked in criminal law for a couple years. I actually got my job through a very vegan networking opportunity. I was at Toronto Veg Fest in the fall of 2011. And for people who are still in law school, the summer before your third and last year of law school, so this critical time when you all find an articling job for the next year, which is like an apprenticeship before you become a full-fledged lawyer. And I hadn't found one yet, probably because I was too discerning about my ethical standards in terms of what firms I wanted to work for. So I was on this panel about animal advocacy, and afterwards, two lawyers came up and they're like, "Hey, we're vegan criminal lawyers. We're not crazy, don't worry. We're normal people. Do you want an articling job?" And I was just like, "What? How did this fall into my lap?" So it set me on the trajectory with criminal law. And those two lawyers ended up being James Silver and Gary Grill, who defend all kinds of activists who get charged with offenses. Notably, recently, you may remember Anita Krines in the pig trial, who was charged for giving water to thirsty, suffering pigs on their way to slaughter. So I managed to do a little bit of that work too while I was there, but animal justice was always in my heart. And so eventually I had the opportunity to leave and start devoting more of my time to building the organization. And it's true that it's a nonprofit / charity, so it's different than being in the business world, but so much of it is the same. The hustle, the requirement to essentially sell something. In our case, we're selling, people are giving us funds to do the work that we're doing because they believe in it and because they have moral reasons for wanting to see animals' lives improve. So a little bit different from selling things, but you still have to appeal to people to support your business or your organization. So, it's such a broad skill set. I would say law is, in some respects, the least important one, obviously essential, but marketing and communications are, right up there with law in terms of running an organization.
Fantastic. And you said a couple things there that we'll kind of circle back to in some of the other questions or conversation starters. So in terms of animal justice, where is animal justice going in the future?
Hopefully to good places. So when I first joined and started working on the organization more, I still had my own law firm at that point. I was working on animal cases almost exclusively, like about half time. And then that freed up the rest of my time to do animal justice work for free. So I was a volunteer. The budget of the organization was minimal. We had basically a kind of a crappy website, and that was about it. And some very passionate volunteers. So there was a lot of goodwill, but not a lot of resources at the beginning. And I do think that one thing that's pretty essential for a startup, whether it be a nonprofit or a business, is an influx of capital in the form of human capital or financial capital. We didn't have human capital, so my capital for free was the impetus. And it kind of got us into a more professional position where we had a direct, fundraising program, administrative aspects that, started to raise more money and get our campaigns out there more, and of course, do more advocacy work. So we've grown from a volunteer-based organization to me as a single employee in 2016, to two of us in 2017. And now I am actually starting to lose track, but about 12 folks who are full-time or mostly full-time that comprise multiple lawyers, a corporate campaigner to hold corporations to account for animal abuse in their supply chains. We have an undercover investigations department. We have a full functioning communication shop. Really all aspects of what a functioning organization needs to do.
Wonderful. So there's already national presence. So just growing that awareness is in the future, and then likely, growing the human capital, like you said, which will in turn grow the financial capital. So great. Now, the next question is interesting for to ask, nonprofit charity based organizations, specifically when it focuses on animal rights, but nonetheless, what are some transformations or trends that you've noticed in your industry?
Well, there's a few things. I would say the biggest thing is that people's compassion for and concern over how we treat animals as society is growing. And it's not only growing, but us and other organizations are increasingly using and channeling that energy and putting it into productive means. So what I mean by that is that there's much more political activism around animals than there ever was, even just a few years ago. We are starting to notice that really pay off in terms of making a difference in campaigns. Let me just give you a couple examples. In 2019, Parliament passed a ban on keeping whales and dolphins in captivity, motivated partially by Marineland and the Vancouver Aquarium as well, where some of you are located. And that kind of thing was remarkable because it was the first time in over 100 years that the federal government had passed any new animal cruelty legislation. It was pretty groundbreaking. And before that, everyone thought it can't really be done. People tried, people kept failing, it just wasn't working. And what's changed in that time is that people have become much more active on this topic. Excuse me. In the last federal election, we saw all the major parties put animal welfare in their campaign platforms, which was, again, a total revelation. And it never would have happened just a couple of years prior. But they're starting to see that people want better animal protection laws. People understand that Canada has some of the worst laws in the Western world. And governments know they can no longer ignore this. So I'm seeing victories pay off.
That is extremely exciting and motivating. And I guess, when things get really, really tough, you can point back to that moment in time and just remind yourself that if things continue to seem impossible, they're not. And you just got to keep pressing on. So thanks for sharing that. That's one of the questions we're going to talk about is inspiration later, but that was inspiring. So again, interesting to ask this question because you are part of a giving back ecosystem and a charitable organization. So the work that you do day to day by default already kind of answers this question. But it's part of our question set that we ask all of our special guests, and it's around giving back and charity. And sometimes people answer it what that means to them personally or what it means to them as an organization, but you can take that as you want. What does giving back or charity mean?
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. The work that we do is really aimed at giving back to animals what we as humans have taken from them. So that's obviously the lens through which we see our work. But for us, it also means being good citizens as a member of civil society. And what I mean by that is that we try to be on the right side of social issues as an organization and respect that it's not just animals who, on behalf of whom we advocate. Those are obviously our number one client, and that's always whose interests we'll keep front of mind. But building relationships with other civil society groups, whether it be supporting Indigenous efforts. There is so much amazing work being done now by Indigenous communities, including the UBCIC, which passed a resolution against factory farming. That's the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. Former Senator Murray Sinclair, who was previously the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that's someone who sponsored the whale bill that passed in Parliament and has just been a tremendous advocate. He has said that our reconciliation includes our relationship with animals. And so we try to be supportive of Indigenous-led efforts, obviously social justice movements that might include racial justice or peace advocacy, and also in the environmental sphere. Obviously, the work that is being done to try to protect animals, especially in the factory farming system, is so closely linked to climate change and trying to ensure that we have a livable future by reducing the number of animals on factory farms, reducing emissions, and getting them out of those bad situations.
It sounds like what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe other people are hearing what I'm hearing as well, but it's not-for-profit organizations can further the way that they are giving back and further their charitable efforts by collaborating more, being open-minded to be collaborative with seemingly maybe very different outfits, but it's all connected. And instead of staying in a silo, you can collaborate and further the giving back model, right? And the charity. That's amazing. So, okay, you mentioned earlier on, I think John Robbins, you said Diet for a New America. So you've mentioned that. That would fall under, of course, books. There's also websites, podcasts, apps, documentaries. And the question is centered around resources. So you might answer this from resources that you have come across in your journey, in your experience, that have helped you become a better lawyer, think more business savvy, entrepreneur-like. Maybe it has to do with veganism, maybe it doesn't. So lots of different ways that you can answer it, but we're basically trying to get resources that have helped you in your journey out, and that might help other people.
Yeah, so I mean, John Robbins was influential to me. I think there's a lot of books that are more up to date now that I would recommend instead of that one. For instance, Peter Singer just updated his copy of Animal Liberation. And I think that's a really great book for a certain type of person, not for everyone, but it tends to appeal to people who are really rational, philosophical thinkers who appreciate moral arguments. So that's somebody I would recommend to like a philosophy or a law student or someone in that vein. For someone who makes choices based more on their emotional reactions to things, I usually refer them to documentaries. Sometimes the more subtle ones can have a bigger impact that deal more with health or climate if somebody's a little bit more resistant to the animal message. But I wouldn't recommend Earthlings right away. I wouldn't recommend Dominion usually right away. That tends to be a little bit too much for many people. But things like What the Health or Forks Over Knives have been influential in my experience. Also Seaspiracy, I was really delighted when that came out. My own personal experience is that I spend a lot of time asking people why they went vegan, and there's often a book or documentary in there. So I think that's really influential and try to do that. Then I would say one other book, I'm not sure how much it would apply to folks in this meeting today, but one book that's been really influential to me is learning how to communicate on an emotional level about the issues that we work on. Is called The Political Brain by a neuroscientist in the US called Dr. Drew Weston. And he takes lots of case studies from political campaigns and says, here's why what the Republicans did with the shock and awe campaign worked really well on humans. It's because our brains work this way, and this type of marketing and information appeals to us. And I think about that a lot. So much of what I think we can accomplish as advocates and what I can accomplish as a lawyer, frankly, is not always changing the law, but it's shifting public opinion as well. So trying, when we have cases or campaigns or bills that we're trying to get passed, communicating about it in a way that the public can appreciate and in a way that resonates with people on an emotional level, because that's extremely powerful and motivating behavioral change.
That's a great recommendation specifically for Veg Networking Canada, which is a group based around entrepreneurs and business owners, because providing or creating or providing or building the space to allow people to consider shifting mindsets is incredibly important in whatever field that we're in. If we're talking about, selling something of value or whatever it might be, or, so that's a great recommendation. So thank you for that. The Political Brain. That's great. Okay. So, before we hit record, Sandra had mentioned that Camille Labchuk and Animal Justice have come out. We can't count how many times your name and the organization's name have come out of people's mouths when we get to this next question, which is centered around inspiration. So we kind of preface it by saying, there might be a person, an organization. We've had people talk about nature and other sort of more bigger things that are sources of inspiration for them, or what inspiration means to them on a philosophical level. So all that to say, when it comes to Camille Labchuk, what does inspiration mean? Where do you find it? What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. For me, I often take inspiration in the stories of individual animals who I come across, oftentimes stories that no one else will ever see. Maybe it's one pig, I think about this one mother pig who we saw in an undercover investigation. She was pregnant, she was sick, she wasn't doing well. And, not to get too graphic, but oftentimes if a pregnant pig is near term and the piglets could survive outside the womb, the industry will simply cut her open and take the piglets out. And there was one horrible instance where on the first day of an investigation, our investigators saw this and was forced to participate in what the industry calls a slash and grab. And, it turned out after an investigation by authorities that she was probably still alive when they did that to her. And so, it's oftentimes individual animals like that I take inspiration from. I will also say animal justice doesn't engage in civil disobedience, and it's not a tactic that we do. We're lawyers, we support the law and making legal changes. But I feel enormously emotional about all of the folks who engage in occupations of farms and sit-ins and people who do open rescue, knowing that they are likely to be prosecuted for their actions, but knowing it's the morally right thing to do. They've tried other means to hold industries to account, to get the law involved, to get, authorities to act on farms when they're abusing animals, and have failed. And so the folks who are willing to risk everything for something that they truly believe in and for the cause of animal rights, those are people I also take tremendous strength and inspiration from.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Nothing more to say on that end. So before we get into the last question, and I'll preface that afterwards, we actually have a question here from somebody live. So let me just read it verbatim and you can take that. A little bit of a curveball, but question. Doesn't Quebec's sentience law stand in opposition to the ag-gag law? As far as I know, there is a education and public awareness component to the law, which does not sound congruent with the ag-gag law. So is the federal government allowed to pass the ag-gag law, given that it potentially opposes Quebec's sentience law?
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's an interesting one. So I would say that sentient laws are really exciting. When people see them being proposed and passed, there's a lot of excitement around that, and that's great. I think that the idea that a sentience law is being proposed is really motivational to people, and it gets a lot of people thinking about and excited about animal rights. But unfortunately, the legal effect of sentience laws around the world, not just in Quebec, has been minimal. The reason for that is that animals are basically already recognized as sentient in law by the virtue of the fact that we have cruelty laws. Obviously, if an animal wasn't sentient, there would be no point in having a law to protect them. So because of that, they've been a really great tool at mobilizing and sensitizing people to issues, but not so much a legal tool so far. But I will say sentience laws are still pretty new, including Quebec's law. There have been cases where advocates have been arguing in court that laws in Quebec should be interpreted in light of the fact that the legislature has made a choice to explicitly recognize animals as sentient. So there's creative legal approaches being tried. I don't think, unfortunately, it's something that's going to affect the federal ag-gag law, but I hope to see this area evolve into something very useful in the future.
Wonderful. Yeah, and we'll touch on that if you'd like to, the federal ag-gag law shortly. And a follow-up to that question would be that question in and of itself is seemingly, just on the surface, a really great opportunity to create space and conversation amongst other people that might get them thinking differently about, oh, wait, yeah, that is logical, and making them maybe potentially mobilize in a way that they wouldn't have else. So to that person who asked that question, I would encourage you to ask that question in individual conversations or even in broader formats as well, because it might trigger somebody to really put two and two together. Okay, so the last question, you've said, this is what I took. I think it was from like the first or second question that you answered. Essentially, like your story about how you didn't find that internship because maybe your values didn't align. And what I took from that was basically some advice, if you would, was stay patient and never compromise your why or your values, right? So prefacing that by saying the last question for you, Camille, is do you have any wisdom, tips, lessons, or advice that you would share with anybody, whether it has to do with business, communication, veganism, entrepreneurship, anything like that, speaking to a wide swath of people, big open-ended question, but it's yours.
Oh, thanks for the question, Justin, and well put. Yeah, I mean, when I was interviewing for those jobs, there's one firm I interviewed with, and they were like, so sometimes we're on the wrong side of animal files. How would you feel about that? And I had some answer that was obviously like fake and contrived, but how I would feel about that. They knew it was fake. I knew it was fake. And I just walked out of there thinking like, Camille, stop this. Don't go down this road. Find another path. I think that is good advice for people in general in this space. I mean, I think one thing that's exciting to me is that there's so many more of us now who see eye to eye on these issues. Like the kinship I feel with all of you immediately, even those who we've just met today, is just so immediate, knowing that we're all on the same page about this fundamental issue that revolves around how we are. I had a meeting last week with a a lawyer slash banker in Toronto who's like the only vegan he knows. His family's not vegan. His wife and children aren't vegan. Doesn't know any vegans at work. His colleagues all make fun of him. And I just reflected on the enormous privilege I have of interacting on a daily basis, mostly with people who share my philosophical beliefs. The amount of times I actually have to watch someone eat meat in the course of a year is like almost zero. So I feel very fortunate. And, I think it's really important for us to find community in the ways that you folks are building it right here and right now with this group. And with your permission, I'd love to start sending more people that I meet, like that guy in Toronto, your way.
Yeah, absolutely. Veg Network in Canada that's exactly what it's for, right? Just a safe space to connect. So taking that, like, which is very powerful and succinct, as advice, wisdom, lessons, or tips would be put yourself in situations to increase the proximity that you share with people who are aligned with you, because it will bolster what you have going on. It might help make the tough times maybe a little less tough, and just overall increase the enjoyment of the experience. There's a quote people have probably seen. I think it's the tiny dragon and the panda bear, and I can't remember who asks who, but it's, the question, I think it's the tiny dragon asks the panda, uh, is it about the journey or the destination? And one of them answers, basically, it's the people that you do it with, the community that you keep, essentially, right? So that's a interesting answer to that last question, Camille. Thank you so much. So before we give you an outro, let people know the Animal Justice website, where they can find out more on Instagram. Surely there's probably something that you like to share in terms of announcements or anything that we maybe missed in the conversation, or anything that came up that you want to go back to. Open floor for you before we let you go.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'd love to mention two things, both of them revolving around ag-gag laws, which have taken over my life lately. The first is that we are challenging Ontario's ag-gag law in court on October 30th. The case is finally going to be heard by a judge. It'll be a 3-day hearing in downtown Toronto. So anyone, Priya, who's around, you're welcome to come join. We're having a rally on the first day, and there may be a link to watch online, which we'll distribute via Animal Justice. We're not sure yet, but hopefully there will be. The second is that, as I mentioned at the outset, the federal ag-gag bill is really heating up, and we've experienced a couple blows on that recently. And so we still have an opportunity to try to halt it from passing in the House of Commons. I'm not sure if that will succeed, but we have resources available at animaljustice.ca and an action page that people can take. If anyone has a Liberal member of Parliament, we're asking people to try to meet with those Liberals, because they are the swing party right now, and they're the ones that we have got to influence. So if you do and you want to reach out, feel free to reach out to me.
All right, folks. So you heard it. If you're in the Toronto area on October 30th for the essentially sort of live act, if you want to call it, demonstration support against the Ontario ag-gag law, you can make yourself available starting October 30th. I think you said it was 3 days. And then as well, if anybody has any connections or knows anybody who has connections to Liberal members of Parliament to help combat and stop the federal ag-gag bill, that would be wonderful. And a lot of our members here at Veg Network Canada will be sharing, I'm sure, this conversation and putting our own spin on it and trying to move and shake, if you would. So wonderful. So everybody, this has been an excellent conversation with Camille Labchuk. You can find out more online, www.animaljustice.ca, exactly how it sounds. And on Instagram, it's animaljustice_. So you can show your support and learn more and find out the resources, and moreover, just be part of a community that consistently is growing across Canada. And also, I've seen online people from outside of Canada taking notice of what's happening within Canada through animal justice. So the reach is probably more than you would imagine. All right, everybody, thank you for listening live, as well as when this message reaches you. Thank you for having some time out of your day to listen to it. This has been another episode of Veg Networking Canada, where we had an awesome conversation with lawyer and executive director of Animal Justice, Camille Labchuk. For now, we're going to bid you adieu, but we'll catch you soon on another episode. For now, take care. Bye-bye.